Hello, my name is Anne-Marie Cannon, and I'm the host of Armchair Historians. What's your favorite history? Each episode begins with this one question. Our guests come from all walks of life. YouTube celebrities, comedians, historians, even neighbors from the small mountain community that I live in. They're people who love history and get really excited about a particular time, place, or person from our distant or not so distant past. The jumping off point is the place where they became curious, then entered the rabbit hole into discovery. Fueled by an unrelenting need to know more, we look at history through the filter of other people's eyes. Armchair Historians is a Belgian Rabbit production. Stay up to date with us through Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Wherever you listen to your podcast, that is where you'll find us. Armchair Historians is an independent, commercial-free podcast. If you'd like to support the show and keep it ad-free, you can buy us a cup of coffee through Ko-fi, or you can become a patron through Patreon. Links to both in the episode notes. I love coffee, and I love history, which is why when I stumbled on the podcast of our next guest, I knew I had found something good. Alycia Asai is the host and producer of Civics and Coffee, a podcast about the people, events, and topics of United States history, shared in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. According to Alycia, unlike a lot of other history-based podcasts, she keeps her episodes short and sweet, giving her listeners their history in the time it takes to finish their morning brew, usually under 15 minutes. She has a bachelor's degree in history and considers herself a history nerd, as opposed to a guru. When she's not researching episodes, she's planning her next vacation, although not so much with COVID. Today, we geek out with Alycia, who tells us about her favorite history. It's a dark one, about a devastating fire in 1911, the events of which were responsible for major changes in U.S. regulations surrounding safety in the workplace. Alycia Asai, welcome and thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited.
Me too. We're just going to get right into it, and I'm going to ask you the question, what's your favorite history that we're going to be talking about today?
Well, my favorite history is kind of a dark story, but it has a great ending in terms of progressive reforms, like many things in history. And so my favorite history is the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire that happened in New York in 1911.
1911 in New York. I think I do know a little bit about this, but I might be confusing it with another. Go ahead, tell us about it.
All right. So it's known as the largest and deadliest workplace disaster. The only one that comes close to that is September 11th. So if you take out September 11th, 2001, it is the deadliest workplace disaster ever recorded in American history.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it was the largest workplace disaster and most deadliest workplace disaster ever recorded on American history. And it took place on March 25th, 1911. And it was at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which was the largest shirtwaist factory in New York at the time, located at 27 Washington Place in Greenwich Village. And the shirtwaist was basically the blouse. It was made very famous by the Gibson Girl. And it was this new age way of women to be able to not have these big bustling corsets and big dresses, right? They could have a nice trim blouse that they could wear. And at the end of the event, 146 people would perish. What it led to was a number of progressive reforms. So if you've ever wondered why you have a fire drill at work or why all of the workplace doors are meant to be open and kept open throughout the working hours, that can all harken back to this disaster. So it was super deadly and super violent, but it led to some great progressive reforms. So the actual fire took place on March 25th, 1911. It was a Saturday. It was about 4:40 p.m. The workers were just getting ready to end their workday, and they noticed on the 8th floor some smoke coming out of a scrap bin. And how the factory was set up was a large cutting room tables. And in other factories, what they would do is they would have bins for all the scraps of material that they weren't using. But the owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, were super efficient in the fact that they built little scrap bins that were sitting right beneath the cutting floor. So all the workers had to do was basically push it down to the ground. They didn't have to worry about, walking their scraps down to the end of the room, making it super efficient. Of course, what that led to was a huge bin filled with super flammable cotton scraps. So at about 4:40, they start to see this little puff of smoke and little fire coming from the scrap bin. They tried in vain to put it out. They didn't have any sprinklers, of course, because that wasn't required in New York at the time, but they did have buckets of water on all of the floors because apparently fires were a common thing with shirtwaists. Go figure. And so they grabbed the bucket of water. They tried to douse it. That didn't work. There was also a fire hose on the 8th floor that they was pumping from a water well up at the roof. They pulled that out. No water pressure. The 8th floor manager was trying very hard for about 3 minutes to try to put out the fire before he said, okay, this can't happen. We're not going to be able to get it out. So everybody got to go. An executive assistant was able to warn the 10th floor, where the owners were currently at in their offices. And because, of course, 1911.
Why do I see where this is going? Why?
Exactly.
Why? And I'm not surprised. Okay, yep. I'm sorry. Just had to say that.
Of course. And so because it's 1911, there's no, fire alarms, there's no PA system, there's no other way of warning except for running upstairs and telling somebody or through the switchboard. And so the executive assistant on the 8th floor did a call to the 10th floor, but the 10th floor never hung up. And so the 8th floor was never able to warn the 9th floor workers, hey, there's a fire. And in fact, the 9th floor workers did not know about the fire until they started to see the flames coming from the windows and the air shaft. So, of course, panic ensued and everybody tried to vacate. This was a fairly large building, and so there were 2 exits available, one on the Washington Street side and one on the Green Street side. But, of course, wanting to be super efficient and not wanting to lose any spare material, the owners had locked the Washington Street doors during work hours, forcing the women and men through the Green Street exit so that they could look at their purse to make sure that they didn't steal any materials, and then also to monitor them to make sure they didn't take any breaks that weren't pre-approved. There was estimates about 200 to 250 people at work that day. All these women on the 9th floor trying to get out. Well, they can't get out through the Washington Street door because that's locked. And the Green Street exit quickly became unpassable both down and up. So here they are stuck on this 9th floor. So some of the women decided that they were going to try to go through the fire escape, which was this rickety old thing that the architect was able to put in place instead of the 3rd staircase. And it was not well put together. It was not really meant to house a lot of people. The fire investigators looked at it and said you couldn't be more than 2 abreast on the fire escape. And so as these women are piling onto this rickety old fire escape, it collapsed from the intense heat and just poor design. And about 20 women fell to their death about 100 feet onto the sidewalk. And there was also some stories about a fence with some spikes, and so some of them were impaled. So super violent. Not a good way to go. I mean, I guess it's better than burning to death, but definitely not my cup of tea. And so the owners were able to, and the people that were on the 10th floor were able to escape up to the roof. And the New York University Law School was right next door. And so they were able to extend a super long ladder and get people off the roof so that they could escape. But basically, if you were on the 9th floor, you were done for. A couple of freight elevator operators came and were doing runs to save some of the workers to get them down into safety, but that they eventually were unable to do any more runs because the intense heat of the fire was warping the elevator and warping the cables, making it unsafe for passage. And so the women basically had a choice to make. they were going to either burn to death or they could take the fate into their own hands and jump. And in fact, many of them did that. There was a reporter on scene, and he recorded 54 bodies jumping from the 9th floor. And what's super unfortunate about this is the fire department was there within minutes of the fire. So they were super responsive and on site. But of course, the Industrial Revolution and the skyscrapers and the buildings of all of these super big factories actually outpaced the technology and the resources of the fire department. And so when they got up on their ladder only reached the 6th floor.
Oh, my goodness.
The fire started 2 floors above that. And really, the predominant number of victims were on the 9th floor. So all they could try to do is try to put the fire out as quickly as possible. And that did not save as many lives as they probably could have had they had other equipment available to them. The fire was put out within 30 minutes, but still managed to kill 146 people.
How many people survived that were on the 9th floor?
Yes, so there was 146 deaths, 78 injuries, and I want to say about another under just about 100 people that were able to survive. So, because they estimated about 250 were on site that day.
Wow.
Yeah. And of course, the owners were fine. Because, of course,
they were. Tell the owners before you tell those people who, are doing the real work. And I bet a lot of them were women.
Oh, yes. Of the 146 that died, 123 were women.
Oh, geez. Okay.
And the shirtwaist factories in general were predominantly immigrant women. And the Triangle factory was actually not really pro-labor, surprisingly, shocker, right? But they had actually experienced a massive strike just 2 years prior because the women wanted to unionize so that they could ask for better working conditions, better hours, better pay. And so the owners were definitely not new to the demands of labor. There was also some suspicious fires. The gentleman who owned the Shirtwaist factory fire had 2 very suspicious fires prior to the Triangle Shirtwaist massive inferno, and that they believe was in an effort to try to collect some insurance money because they paid exorbitant premiums as being such a high risk factory. So they don't know that this was intentionally set. They would like to believe that it was not, but there is some, there's some questions there. You already experienced 2 fires. You took no steps to prevent a third fire. And of course, that third fire ended up being the most dangerous and deadly, costly fire. The women who decided not to jump and stay on the 9th floor were so badly burned that family members had to use things like hair clips or shoes or clothing to try to identify the bodies. They were all brought to a pier known as Misery Lane, and families and friends were basically brought in to look at all of these bodies that remained unclaimed. I believe it took about a week for the majority of the bodies to be claimed. So, super depressing moment in our history, but there's a huge shift towards progressivism and labor laws as a result. Frances Perkins was there at the fire as it was occurring, and Frances Perkins is famous as being the first female cabinet member in the United States, and she was put as the Secretary of Labor. And
so was she working there, or was she just like there? She saw the fire.
She just happened to be there. So she was not a worker. She was fairly well off. She didn't need to do factory work, and she was part of labor unions and really pushing this progressive labor movement. And she just happened to hear the fire alarms and the fire trucks, and so she kind of ran out and she saw this macabre scene of bodies flying from the 9th floor and these intense flames. And she never forgot that. She actually pointed to the Triangle Shirtwaist factory later in life as kind of the needed push towards progressivism that would surely, go throughout the United States in the next few years.
Sure. This reminds me of, I did an episode, I interviewed the hosts of the podcast Mystery History, and they talked about the Radium Girls.
Mm-hmm. I listened to that episode. I loved that episode.
Yeah, that was just devastating to hear. So that was also kind of part of that same moving forward, and it changed labor law. And
oh, yeah.
Unfortunately, ghastly things had to happen in order for that to happen. And of course, the men were wearing hazmat uniforms basically to work with the radium, but women were licking the brushes because they go faster.
Right. And they're more dexterous, right? That was the story that they were told. Oh, you're so much better at this. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's always the women, right? The women have to take the brunt of the devastation and of the misery in order to prompt some sort of change. So after the fire happened, there were huge outpouring of support in New York. It was a large funeral procession. They estimated about 350,000 people participated. They said about 100,000 people marched, and then about 250,000 people lined the streets of the route. And it was raining and just super, super dark and macabre. And the calls for justice and calls for change really started hammering the New York upstate in Albany, and also the political machine, Tammany Hall. So during that great strike that I mentioned 2 years prior, Tammany Hall, the political machine definitely came down on the side of the owners and instructed their cops to beat up the strikers and jail the strikers, right? So just no support for the labor movement at all. Well, something in Tammany Hall kind of shifted, and they realized, well, we really need people to vote for us so that we can maintain power. Who's going to be voting for us? Well, we have these huge swaths of immigrants who are typically working in factories and in tenement situations. How can we get their support? Well, the best way to get their support, obviously, would be to support a labor movement. And so they helped erect a commission to figure out some reforms that they could put into place. And so within 6 months, the commission came up with 15 new laws to help prevent disasters like this from happening. 8 of those were adopted. So of 15 laws, 8 were adopted and put into place. And in the next year, 25 laws were proposed, and that included things like mandatory sprinklers in all of these buildings, fire drills, and forcing doors to be unlocked during working hours. So major, huge fire safety reforms, a lot of labor movement. And within 4 years of the fire, New York actually had the toughest and strictest labor laws in the country. And that was in part as a direct result of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire. So it was a good ending overall, not good for the 146 people who passed away and the 78 people who were severely injured. The owners were actually put up on charges. They were charged with 6 counts of manslaughter, I believe it was. But unfortunately, they were found not guilty. So
only
6. Yeah. The reason why the 6 charges were put were because they were people that they could identify as dying in the fire and on the 9th floor, and as a result of the locked Washington Street exit. And they wanted to make sure that they could prove that the owners knew that the doors were locked and, made no plans to unlock them during any kind of an emergency, because they could prove that those 6 deaths were a direct result of the fire and being locked into the Washington Street exit. So they never paid for their crimes. They never paid for their labor violations. But overall, the country got to see a huge swell of progressive reforms, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt being elected as president with his New Deal and choosing Frances Perkins as his very first Secretary of Labor and the first female cabinet member. And she really was very committed to labor reform and labor movement and progressive laws that helped during FDR's administration. So that's my favorite history.
So why this history?
A number of reasons why. It has some darkness into it. I like, this sounds very sick, but I like the dark, twisty parts of history. I like the death and I like that. And I think it proves a point, right? Because as so much of history does, right? Civil War. What did the Civil War lead to? Well, now we got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. I think it's a perfect snapshot of our country needing to be smacked in the face violently sometimes in order to be on board with change. And I've always had an affinity for New York as a city. My family's from back east, and I remember hearing this, I think in, seventh grade history class, and just being infinitely fascinated. Of course, I didn't get to all the gory details that I later discovered, but it's always struck with me because it was such a powerful movement and such a powerful event. Mm-hmm. And I think too, this was such a time of women coming into their own, and that it took the death of 123 women for, the world to kind of wake up and realize, hey, we got to do better working conditions. I mean, children were allowed to be in factories at this time, mm-hmm. and eventually that got outlawed as kind of a direct result of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory. So I just think it's a good snapshot as to what historically America has to go through before it's ready to hear some change.
Does history repeat itself? Is that
I mean,
does it really matter? Like, sometimes I wonder, but, talking about these histories, I always, this one, the Radium Girls, some other ones. I just talked to a gentleman who lives in Berlin, and there's familiar feelings, even though there's very different situations. I see these themes playing out in our governments, and, this past 4 years, need I mention that? But, it's that sense of injustice, and it just makes me so pissed when I hear these stories. I want people to just do the right thing. And, unfortunately, sometimes it takes these horrible, ghastly disasters. And the reason the political machine did anything was politically motivated.
Yep. It wasn't even a crisis of conscience. It was literally, right. We need the votes, so I guess we'll be on the side of progressivism. Sure. Yeah. And they did try to double dip and play both sides for a minute, but they had a gentleman by the name of Al Smith who just was like, nope, we're going to go for it. Let's be progressive. Let's do it. We're going to pass all these laws. It's also a very interesting look at politics as being intimately involved in people's lives. Yeah. I think that's also
that's a really good way of putting that. That is a really good way of putting that. I've never thought of it in those terms. Yeah.
Yes, because even, prior to this fire, the Tammany Hall, they would help you pay your heating bill during the winter, or if you got laid off, they would, throw you a couple of bucks. But the gentleman, Al Smith, he was very much committed to the idea of, I don't want to just be there when it's rough for you. I want to be there and support you to be the best that you can be. And right. That's what government should be about. The government should be about supporting the people. That's why we're here. We were elected by the people. We should represent the people. And, it's funny that it took until 1911 for that kind of ethos to be in the political discourse, but I'm happy that it got there.
Well, I think there's always been people throughout history who have been what I would call on the side of right. Their voices don't always come to the surface in the historical record. I'm thinking about the Lynch Law lady. She was a co-founder of the NAACP. Ida. Yeah, I did a show on her, but she's like somebody I want to know more about, that I want the history books in school to tell us about. That is the kind of life that I want us to be looking at and talking about. And and this is and holding up. Yeah. Where do we see this history in pop culture?
Well, it's with you every single day that you go to work. So every time you participate in a fire drill, every time you see the firemen come and inspect your workplace, if you've ever noticed any place that you go into, a place of business, their doors are not locked. And that's all a direct result of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire. All of these progressive reforms and labor laws that to us, we we think, duh, of course you should have sprinklers in a workplace. Of course you should have a fire alarm. Of course you should practice fire drills. Well, that wasn't common practice in 1911. And you see it every day now as a result of, this catastrophic loss of life, this event that could have been, prevented and mitigated. It didn't need to be such a heavy toll in terms of lives, but as a result of that, and I think it kind of scared America straight, or at least scared New York straight, and they realized we can't just fiddle-faddle around with workers' lives.
So did the federal government follow suit, or was that years later? Do you know that trajectory?
I believe it was years later. So I know New York was kind of the prominent one, and then that individual states kind of spread and started copying the precedent, I guess, that New York set. And obviously with FDR coming in and doing all of his New Deal reforms and progressive reforms, and having Francis Perkins as his Secretary of Labor definitely helped promulgate the idea of progressive labor laws.
Is there any movies or anything or novels that you're aware of that is based on this?
There is one social historian who covered the book, and he wrote it in 2003. David something, I want to say. He did one in 2003, and then there was, I believe it was a reporter who did an oral history of the Shirtwaist fire in the 60s, I want to say.
Oh, wow.
But other than that, there's no major movies that have been based off of it, which I'm like, you guys are just missing an opportunity, because this is fascinating. And I think it's got a little bit of everything, right? It's got intrigue, it's got political machinations. It's so fascinating. Big labor and big bosses, and how does that come together? And it's a true story, which always make the best movies. But no, they haven't made a film as far as I know.
I usually go into history from a series or a movie, and then I start going down the rabbit hole, because that's how my mind works.
Also, for me, why I love this story so much is that it really grabbed my attention in history. So I ended up going to college and becoming a history major, and I would say this is the first story that really grabbed my attention, because it showed that history is today. It's not just yesterday, and it impacts your lives all of the time. And if you fail to learn from history, you are doomed to repeat it. I definitely believe in that saying. And I think that's shown itself over and over again.
I did minor in history, but I've always been drawn to what's the story? What's the story about this? So, and this kind of leads to what you're doing with your podcast. So why don't you tell us about Civics and Coffee?
Sure. So Civics and Coffee is a history podcast all about United States history, because I'm a big U.S. history nerd, is what I like to call myself. I am definitely not the upper echelons of historians, but I love it. I love learning about it. I love hearing why we do something. And I do know for history, for a lot of people, history is not always something that drives their passion, or they think it's this long, episodic, boring story. And so when I was kind of developing Civics and Coffee, I said, how about I share stories of history in the time it takes you to enjoy your morning cup of coffee? You can get a quick little history rundown, and, you're none the worse for the wear. You don't have to dedicate 3 hours. You don't have to dedicate weeks trying to read a book. You can get some good, quick highlights about U.S. history all in the time it takes you to drink your coffee. And so Civics and Coffee was born.
Brilliant. So when did you start your podcast?
I started my podcast in August of 2020. So it's still fairly new.
A lot of people started their podcast during the pandemic. I started mine in April as well. Was that one of the reasons you were able to start it, or was it something that you had planned to launch and that type of thing?
No, actually, it was very spontaneous, which I find very odd for me as a person, because I am somebody who likes to research and plan and have, 15 plans of attack. But I was having a conversation with a couple of friends over the 4th of July holiday, and we were talking kind of current events and how they have historical significance because of our history. And they were like, oh, I don't know. I never got into history. I never liked history. It was so long and boring. And that's where the seed was planted. And so it was between the 4th of July weekend and August as I researched a bunch of episodes. I kind of thought, okay, how do I do this? How do I break it down for people that maybe history is not, their favorite subject ever, but they have 15 minutes to spare. And so that's why I decided. I had a lot of history books lying around from my time in college. And one of the little history challenges I gave myself in my youth was to read a biography on every United States president. And so I had successfully done all of that. So I have all of this history material, and I was like, how do I get this to everybody, but in a short, fun format, because my George Washington biography was like 700 pages. You can't, some people will love that, but other people will be like, just give me the highlights. Who is he? Why do I need to care about him? Right. And that's kind of part of the ethos of Civics and Coffee is I want to break down some of the big, huge historical figures that everybody knows, but then I also want to tell the stories that people don't remember learning in high school or maybe it wasn't covered in high school and give them a fresh perspective on history and maybe give them a reason to tie that story to their present.
Right. So what you just said makes me think of Mark Twain, and because it's harder to do what you're talking about because you have to decide on things. You have to decide what you're leaving out, what you're keeping in. Mm-hmm. You have to experiment with different things to see what works. That's how my mind works. But Mark Twain said, I wanted to write you a short note, but I didn't have the time because it is actually labor intensive to do that.
I applaud anybody who does interviews as a podcast because just doing it myself, I stress out very much. So I can only imagine, trying to find guests and, and hosting a conversation. And then also the editing. The editing for me would be a complete nightmare. So if I had to do it with an interview, I think I would. Oh,
that's so funny because I think what you do is a lot harder to come up with a narrative because even though I'm a writer, I hate writing, if that makes any sense, because I feel like it's just so difficult because I want to get everything right. I want to get so you seem like that kind of person too. So that's not easy. It's not easy. So how many episodes do you do a month? You do?
I do one episode a week, so 4 to 5, depending on however many Saturdays. I drop my episodes on Saturdays. Okay. I've done a couple of bonus episodes for, voting because, again, Civics and Coffee, how could I not do an episode on your civic duty? And then I did one yesterday for Thanksgiving. And
I listened to that one. I actually did listen to that one when I was cooking.
Oh, good.
I was putting up my Christmas tree. I listened to a couple of your episodes. Where do we find you? Do you have a website?
I just have my Buzzsprout RSS feed right now. I am working on a website. It's not finished yet. So primarily, you guys can find me on the Facebook. I'm popular right now for a number of reasons, but it is still a huge social media channel. So you can look for me there at Civics and Coffee, all one word. And then Instagram is where I'm pretty active. And
that's how I found you. That's where I found you, yeah.
Civics and Coffee at Instagram as well, all one word. And I just started a Twitter handle for Civics and Coffee. So you can look for me on Twitter at CivicsPod. So.
Okay, and I'll link back to all those in the episode notes. Was there anything else that you wanted to tell me about that maybe I didn't ask?
I definitely would suggest anybody who's interested in the Triangle Fire. I really just scratched the surface in this episode. There's the book by the David gentleman that I can't remember, of course.
We'll put that in the episode notes, yeah.
Okay, good. He does a really great job with social history. So he tells the stories of some of the people who lost their lives in the fire. And I think history is so personal for so many people that I think that will really help drive home kind of the devastation of the fire and why it was so important and such a catalyst for change. So I would definitely recommend everybody to go read that book. But other than that, nope, I think we covered it.
Cool. All right.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciated it. I'll talk to you soon.
Take care. Bye.
There you have it. Alycia Asai, Civics and Coffee. Be sure to check out our episode notes to find out more about Alycia, her podcast, and the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. Thanks for joining us and have a great week.